Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Thomas, and this channel is dedicated toward educational matters. Today is video number 173 on the reciprocal system of theory. And this reciprocal system of theory was devised by Dewey B. Larson. Mr. Larson died back in 1990, but before he did, he put out a lot of books, a lot of articles, all kind of focused on his various aspects of the reciprocal system. It is a system of theory. So it is a theory of everything, and it is something that if you gain a little mastery over, you can apply it to whatever field, whatever subject that you'd like to apply it to. I also love it because it gives you some level of independence of thought where you're not beholden to a bunch of scientists to tell you what you're supposed to believe about certain things. You can really derive your beliefs from a very simple and logical and straightforward reciprocal system. Now, it appears sometimes that it isn't straightforward because our minds have been put in this labyrinth that we call modern science, where every subject is disjointed from every other subject, and a lot of the conclusions are made based on whether the math works or not, but not based on how the concepts fit together. And so there's a lot of constants and other fudge factors that are clouding our minds. And then so when something straightforward and frankly obvious like the reciprocal system comes into place, we reject it as being nonsense. A lot of times simply because we've never heard of it before, or we've never heard of him before. This is eerily similar to what's going on in the world today in general. There's a lot of common sense and relatively obvious things that are being said out there that are being rejected as being ridiculous by the people whose minds have been poisoned by not only the guys in the white lab coats, but the guys with the talking head, with the talking heads on the media, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the basic idea behind the reciprocal system is that we don't live in a universe of matter. We don't live in a universe of energy. We live in a universe of motion. And motion is the relationship between space and time. Space and time are the two sole components of motion. Just think of speed. Speed is space over time. 10 miles of space in 1 hour of time. 10 miles per hour. That is speed. But all other scientific quantities are also relationships between space and time. Space and time have multiple dimensions. This is what Larson calls their coordinate aspects. We do know that space has coordinate aspects, X, Y, Z coordinates. 3 dimensions of space, maybe more, depending on whose geometry you're using. And time also has 3 or more dimensions. Now, those dimensions of time are not dimensions of space. They can't be measured using space-like dimensions, but they are still 3 dimensions, 3 independent variables that are going in X, Y, Z coordinate style into time. You might think of them as I, J, K. Those are rotations. So that has been attempted, and it seems to be working using I, J, and K, the imaginary numbers. And then also space and time have their clock aspect. So they have their coordinate aspect, multiple dimensions, and they have their clock aspect. This is the scalar motion. A scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude, but it has no direction. The easy analogy for that is using a balloon with a magic marker. You put some dots on the balloon with the marker, you blow up the balloon, all of the dots are moving away from each other. That is an outward scalar motion. You suck in the balloon, all the dots are moving toward each other. That is an inward scalar motion. Scalar motion, the only direction it has is either in or out. And that is what Larson calls clock time and clock space. Clock time, it's always getting later and later, the flow of time or the progression of time. Space also has its clock aspect. That was observed back in the 1920s by the Hubble telescope as all of the galaxies moving away from each other. Now, that you can object to that on grounds of, doctoring, faking these measurements and so on. Even if you did that, there would be another replacement for this progression of space. Something is getting farther and farther apart. That's the basic idea. Space is always getting farther and farther apart. Just like time is always getting later and later and later. Then space and time also have their discrete unit postulate. So each one, space and time, have a minimum unit below which there is no space or time. There's only the opposite. So there is a minimum unit of space, which is about 4.5 times 10 to the minus 8 meters. Very small, but very large compared to the size of an atom. And within that unit, there is no space. There is only time. That is what Larson calls the time region. And that's where atomic phenomena and so on take place. And that's what we'll be talking about a little bit today. And then there is a minimum unit of time, which is incredibly small. 1.5 times 10 to the minus 16 seconds. So that means that within 1 second, you have 6.576 quadrillion seconds, or units of time per second. Okay, now we are looking at, now if you have 1 unit of space, in 1 unit of time, you have the speed of light. And the speed of light, Einstein says the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe. Larson says the speed of light is the midpoint of the universe. And there's an entire half of the universe that's moving faster than the speed of light. Larson calls this the cosmic sector. The half that's moving slower than the speed of light, the half that Einstein knew about, he calls the material sector. Here we are looking at his 1979 book called Nothing But Motion. And we're in chapter 9 called Rotational Combinations. And he's actually looking at the material atoms. But this also applies to cosmic atoms. An atom is really a combination of motions. There are 4 different basic kinds of motion. There is your translational motion. There is your vibrational motion. There is your rotational motion. And then there is your rotational vibration. And these all have their different functions, or they lead to different results in the physical system that creates things like atoms and molecules and charges. We're going to go back just a bit. He's going to be talking about the rotational base here, and this is a key concept that you get, and this is kind of where the atom starts with the building block. The real building block of the atom is the photon, and the photon is really your simple harmonic motion. This is your wave-like motion, which Larson contends is your combination of a translational motion in one x in the x coordinate and a 90-degree opposite of vibrational motion. So when you combine the two, you combine the up and down motion with the sideways motion, you end up with a simple harmonic motion. Now, some people have come along, KVK Nehru in particular, and said that no, the photon comes from a birotation. It comes from two rotational motions superimposed on each other, and that creates a simple harmonic motion, which was shown by Leonhard Euler in the 18th century with what he called the epsilon function. Okay, I tend toward the birotation, but other people do not. So we will be looking at both of those approaches at a certain point. But right now we're going to take over in chapter 9, and I'm going to read the same paragraph again about the rotational base. The combinations in which the net rotation is in space, the positive displacement, can be identified with the relatively stable atoms and particles of our local environment and constitute what we will call the material system. For the present, we will confine the discussion to the members of this material system and will leave the inverse type of combination, the cosmic system, for later consideration. Inasmuch as the oscillating photon is being rotated in two dimensions, the basic positive rotation, 1 unit of two-dimensional positive displacement is required to neutralize the negative vibrational displacement of the photon. Now, when he's saying positive and negative, he's referring to positive is actually less than the speed of light or material, and negative is greater than the speed of light or cosmic. He has it reversed because we live in the material sector. We observe and we measure from the material sector, and so he calls that the positive, even though it really is the negative because it's slower than the speed of light. 1 unit of two-dimensional positive displacement is required to neutralize the negative vibrational displacement of the photon and reduce the net total displacement to 0. Because of its lack of any effective deviation from unit speed, the reference speed, the speed of light, in all directions outward, this combination of motions has no observable physical properties, and for that reason it was somewhat facetiously called the rotational equivalent of nothing in the first edition. But this understates the significance of the combination. While it has no effective net total magnitude, its total rotational component does have a direction. The idea of a motion that has direction but no magnitude sounds something like a physicist's version of the Cheshire Cat, but the zero effective magnitude is a property of the structure as a whole, while the rotational direction of the two-dimensional motion, which makes the addition of further positive rotational displacement possible, is a property of one component of the total structure. Thus, even though this combination of motions can do nothing itself, it does constitute a base from which something, a material particle, can be constructed that cannot be formed directly from a linear type of motion. We will therefore call it the rotational base. There are actually two of the rotational bases. The one we have been discussing is the base of the material system. Structures of the cosmic system are constructed from a different base, one that is just the inverse of the material base. In this inverse combination, the photon is oscillating in space, the positive displacement, and rotating in time, negative displacement. Successive additions, and Okay, so there's a rotational base and a cosmic rotational base, which is the inverse. That is true of everything. Everything in the material sector has its counterpart in the cosmic sector, which is exactly the inverse of it. All you do is you switch the roles of space and time. So whatever is happening in time is happening over here. Whatever is happening in space is happening in time here, and whatever is happening in space here is happening in time here is happening in space here, or vice versa. That's all you do. So that's what makes the one thing that makes the reciprocal system powerful is that even though we can't see the cosmic sector and we can't really measure what's going on there, we know exactly what's going on there because we know what's going on in the material sector, and its exact inverse is what's going on in the cosmic sector. So it's kind of, it's kind of like a mirror image. You can't see, really inside the mirror, but you know exactly what's going on in it. That's not a good example, maybe, but it's a mirror image, and so we know exactly what's going on there without being able to actually see or measure any. Okay. Um, Successive additions of rotational displacement to the rotational base produce the combinations of motions that we identify as the subatomic particles and the atoms of the chemical elements. The next two chapters will describe the structures of the individual combinations. Before beginning this description, however, it will be in order to make some general comments about the implications of the theoretical conclusion that the atoms and particles of matter are systems of rotational motions. One of the most significant results of the new concept of the structure of atoms and particles that has been developed from the postulates of the reciprocal system is that it is no longer necessary to invoke the aid of spirits or demons or their modern equivalents, mysterious hypothetical forces of a purely ad hoc nature, to explain how the parts of the atom hold together. Now, if you recall, in legacy science, they talk about the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force. And these are forces that don't exist anywhere in the universe except inside the atom. And they have a range of this incredibly small scope, um, basically meaning that they are ad hoc explanations. They don't, they just were pulled in out of no place to explain why an atom holds together, which it shouldn't, because in their concept of the atom, there are a bunch of protons in the nucleus of an atom that should be repelling each other, you know, because they're positive charges which repel each other. But they don't because of this strong nuclear force. So so Larson is really equating that to the spirits or demons of ancient history that used to explain the same kind of thing. Now we don't use such kind of religious language of spirits or demons, but we call it the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force instead, which is exactly the same thing. It's garbage. It's total garbage. Okay, and Larson calls it out, but nobody's really willing to, no scientist, by now, anyone who's a scientist who's been listening to me for the last 2 minutes is throwing a tantrum because they're being called out on their crap. Okay, mysterious hypothetical forces of a purely ad hoc nature to explain how the parts of the atom holds together. There is nothing to explain because the atom has no separate parts. It is one integral unit, and the special and distinctive characteristics of each kind of atom are not due to the way in which separate parts are put together, but are due to the nature and magnitude of the several distinct motions of which each atom is composed. At the same time, this explanation of the structure of the atom tells us why such a unit can expel particles or disintegrate into smaller units, even though it has no separate parts, how it can act, in some respects, as if it were an aggregate of subatomic units, even though it is actually a single integral entity. Such a structure can obviously part with some of its motion or absorb additional units of motion without in any way altering the fact that it is a single entity, not a collection of parts. When the pitcher throws a curveball, it is still a single unit. It is a baseball, even though it now has both a translational motion and a rotational motion, which it did not have while still in his hand. We do not have to worry about what kind of a force holds the rotational part, the translational part, and the horsehide covered nucleus together. There has been a general impression that if we can get particles out of an atom, then there must be particles in atoms. That is, the atom must be constructed of particles. This conclusion seems so natural and logical that it has survived what would ordinarily be a fatal blow, the discovery that particles which emanate from the atom in the process of radioactivity and otherwise are not the constituents of the atom. That is, they do not have the properties which are required of the constituents. Furthermore, it is now clear that a great variety of particles that cannot be regarded as constituents of normal atoms can be produced from these atoms by appropriate processes. Okay, we're going to stop there. We will come back to this paragraph and go into it further next time out. So thanks for tuning in. Keep your chin up, and we'll see you tomorrow.